This is the logo for the part one for the YouTube channel. So this is the live stream. So this is something that was created for last, well, I guess for the symposium, is this virtual environment. And this is, the URL for this is pre.experience.numen.games. So someone created a virtual environment for the Active Inference Symposium. There's the textbook there. There's me as my avatar. I didn't really bother to get dressed up for this shot. It's just a screenshot, and here's the Active Inference book. You can explore that book. You have seating here. It's just kind of like almost like Second Life, where I remember being in Second Life about 15 years ago doing some academic things. We had some academic spaces in Second Life that were really interesting. And so this is sort of like that. Here's another shot of the Active Inference book. This is the Symposium program. You can open. You have to hit your E button and hold it down, and you can read the program. Flip the pages. There's part of the program there. There are some courses over there, Active Inference Institute courses, so you can go over there and explore the course content. This is the Active Inference Institute logo and floating in the air here. There's a meeting room over here, the Symposium Legacy, a cognitive map of Active Inference. And then this is courses scaffolded by the Institute. Physics is information processing, Active Inference with the social sciences. This is more of a logo here. You can do all sorts of interesting things in these virtual environments. Like you have to represent space in interesting ways. So it's very interesting stuff, and I like to see this sort of thing. I don't know how this was. I don't know who made this, how this was made necessarily. They just gave a short discussion about the contents, but it's it's quite useful. I think quite interesting. So this was another talk, the phenomenological robot. So this was, again, about active inference and applying active inference to different areas of inquiry. This is Jean-François Cloutier. This is a research fellow at the Institute. So the Institute supports several research fellows who are able to pursue their work under an umbrella of an institute. And he did this work with looking at robots and phenomenology and active inference. And so one of the questions he was asking in this talk was, what does it take at a minimum for an autonomous robot to learn to survive in a world it knows initially nothing about? This is a problem, of course, that a lot of AI research is interested in. This is something that's motivated world models, where you want the system to know something about the world without training it from the start. So you train the model, and then it basically only knows the things that it's been trained on. You want your robot to be able to sort of boot up in a world, figure things out, and then maybe get training later. So this is kind of a long-standing question. When I was in graduate school, we had a professor in the cognitive science program who was really on developmental robotics, and he used to have these his take on this question was to use a developmental approach to build this developmental robot. The robot would just kind of boot up and gain experience from online learning, and that was that. There were some successes there in that research, but this is a hard question. It's a hard problem to solve. And so, I thought it was interesting that he had this take on it. Okay, so then this is Alex Sabine, who was doing these simulations of ants. So this is inference, active inference. So active inference. The Daniel Friedman loves word puns, and he likes to talk about the institute's affordances and all this, and he has this thing about inference because Daniel's background is in looking at ant behavior, and this is Alex Sabine's work though, and he has this alexsabine.github.io, and this is a fixed ant colony. So these ants are all these little Markov machines that he has running, and they're running around and they're behaving like real ants. So they're reproducing biological behaviors through a computational model. This is another shot of this ant colony. So I guess if you go to this website, the GitHub.io site, you can see these animations and these simulations for yourself. But the ant is exploring the space, and they're kind of behaving like ants, I guess. So that's, and then this is more about like sort of how this works. This is modeling a lot of the ant anatomy with a head, thorax, abdomen, 6 legs, and antenna. Realistic morphogenic movement with leg coordination and natural gait patterns. There's dampening, there are pheromone networks between ants. There's tunnel construction, multi-level chambers. So he's modeling the ant colonies, as these structures in dirt. There's collective decision making, territory and combat, and memory entanglement. So all these things, of course, pheromone networks are important because ants, when they sort of explore their environment, they lay down a pheromone. The pheromone tells other ants where to go for things, and they build this network of pheromone trails that they can use as a collective memory. So that's why he's modeling memory entanglement. And then, of course, you can model the social complexity of social insects as well. And so this kind of work looks really interesting. Here's some more about the ant colonies. He just has this sort of diagrams and descriptions, specifications. This is another thing he did, was a marine ecosystem simulation. This again is a simulation where he's looking at different types of algal growth, plankton drift, and oxygen levels with different aspects of marine environments. So you have all these different marine environments where you see collective behavior and pattern formation. I have to say, this year there were a lot of simulations. So we had, in terms of software, we had the main software platforms for active inference. I think ActInf was represented there. There is some things on biorobotics, and a couple other people who were talking about ways that you can sort of implement active inference as a solution. And then you had these software packages or people who are doing almost like A-life simulation. So this is like an A-life simulation, and this is interesting to active inference because we're interested in behavior, output behaviors, and so this is all kind of in that category. So this work by Alex Sabine, and then there's work later actually associated with what Adam Safran is doing that's also very interesting in terms of A-life simulations and getting at some of the questions in active inference. So this was some of Adam's set. This is not the work I was talking about with respect to AI safety, but this is Dream to Explore. This is a world model inspired architecture. So this is Gobesh Subaraj, Arina Rish, and Adam Safran. And I think Arina was the one who gave the talk. And so this is in collaboration with Mila in Montreal. And this is Dream to Explore. So what they're doing is they're implementing this dreaming algorithm. They're doing this, I guess, as a world model. I know we've talked about this in the meetings, but this is basically that work. So Dream to Explore AIME. This is the architecture. So you have data collection, you have an agent that has an exploratory policy, you have an environment with limited interactions, you have experience, which are these parameters here, the unfortunate acronym SARS, replay buffer, which gives real trajectories, And that goes down to the world model learning, where you have this variational autoencoder, which serves as the prior, VR plus perceiver, and then reward model. So you have this representation model, transition model, and value prediction. And then those will go down to imagination-based planning, which is where you have the imagined, the actor, the critic, and the explorer. And then that goes down to an improved state policy or an improved safe policy, which then feeds back to data collection. So this kind of is a framework for AI safety, but the focus here is on learning using dreaming as a mechanism for consolidating memories and other types of behaviors. So they talk about vulnerable and embodied AI, developing AI agents that recognize and model their own vulnerability, similar to biological systems, encourages behaviors that prioritize safety and avoid harmful decisions to herself and others. Then there's unified frameworks for AI safety. So building agents based on the free energy principle to ensure agents can manage internal states, which is the world model, in response to external uncertainties, aligning with human compatible objectives, and promoting safety and pro-social behavior. So that's kind of the boilerplate on that. Then there's, of course, the implications of Dream to Explore for AI safety itself, the reduced real-world interaction. So physical systems could be damaged during exploration. So we don't necessarily want them to go out and explore the world. We want them to gain experience sort of in place while they're dreaming. Human safety could be compromised by learning agents. We want to make sure the agents are fully trained before we put them in contact with humans. And expensive or irreversible action should be minimized. So the safer exploration is one of the goals of this. So the model can explore what-if scenarios in imagination before attempting risky behaviors in reality. And then the containment portion of this is that the imagination-based approach creates a natural containment mechanism where potentially dangerous policies can be evaluated and diagnosed in simulation before deployment. So this is about training agents and this view of AI safety, that this training an agent, giving it information about things it's not seen before, is something that happens in this dream state. And so, it's like the machine is like dreaming, and then it wakes up and it goes about its business, fully trained in knowing what's going on in the world. So this is another approach to that question. How do you make a machine that behaves adaptively in the face of things it's never seen before? Now, this is the talk I mentioned about the economics of AI. So this is reflections on economic myths emerging about AI in the future. This is this website, cartographyofgenerativeai.net, is this person's website. And they give this talk on net zero job losses from AI, enriching learning networks for adaptive resilience. So this is just kind of about this idea of AI replacing everyone's jobs and like how to maybe overcome that or how to think about that differently and so forth. So then it mentions the 2 economic myths about AI's future impact on humanity. The first myth is AI will shrink the bad. AI will take over inefficient humans, which means, of course, humans will lose jobs. And then that's one myth. And of course, like all other technologies, there's job replacement, but there's also job creation. And then the other myth is AI will help grow the good, amplify human meaning and contribution. This is where there's a cooperativity between machines and humans. And of course, those are both myths in the sense that, they're not sort of predestined outcomes. Then he talks about the science of predicting economic futures. Your future is more accurately predicted by information property clusters networks and meta-networks in which you are in. So he has this figure from Hidalgo and Hausman from PNAS 2009 and the Atlas of Economic Complexity, which show GDP per capita and economic complexity, showing the countries as they're ranked. And then this graph here, which I can't really read the y-axis, it's basically observed growth between 1995 and 2000, or 1985 and 2000, and then growth predicted from mismatch between economic complexity and GDP per capita in 1985. So this is kind of a comparison here, and just different ways you can plot the data to show that economic complexity predicts future economic growth. And then there's this interesting graph here on the right, which is where you have over time, you have this sort of knowledge and know-how in our society's computational capacity. You have person byte, firm byte, and then you have people networks and networks of firms. So you see that people are like sort of a person byte. The maximum value for knowledge and know-how is a person byte. So if you have networks of cells, which are people, you have a capacity that reaches this person byte, which is a unit of information, I guess. And then in the networks of people, you have an increase maximizing as the firm byte, which is, a firm like an organization or a company or something like that. And then networks of firms, so not just networks of people, but networks of these firms. And that goes beyond the firm byte and maximizes, I guess, in something else, maybe like a market byte or something like that. So this is kind of a nice graph because it reminds me of a lot of the biocomplexity graphs that exist where they're looking at things like cells, organisms, ecosystems, and then looking at biocomplexity as it builds from there. So that's very interesting work. Noticed in general there was a very strong emphasis on complexity theory as well as active inference. So people talking about how they were influenced by early complexity theory, how they were influenced by current complexity theory, and a lot of these themes where people are dealing with complex systems, and they recognize they're dealing with complex systems. So it's very good secondary sort of theme here. This is a key intervention approach to AI augmented learning capacity building. And the tagline here is boost the learning capacity of all your networks. So these are nested layers of learning from, I guess, from cells, cell networks, to organs, to humans, to networks of humans. And you have these nested layers of learning in each. You go from the individual to the collective. So, the individual and the collective deal with learning differently. There's something called interlearning in the collective, which are embedded in the interactions and not the individuals. This is kind of, another kind of take on the idea of emergence. And then, of course, individuals will be influenced by changes in the individuals, even within large groups. Collective learning, by contrast, are changes in the agreements and practices between members of the collective. So, you have this difference between the individual nodes kind of learning their own things and that not propagating, versus collective learning where all the things that the nodes know are embedded in a set of rules that manage the connections between the nodes. So the rules of interaction are sort of the collective learning. The rules of the nodes or the single units are embedded in individual learning. So this is a Valginin Carlut, and his talk is Active Inference for the Social Sciences. This is something that the Active Inference Institute is quite interested in, applying active inference to different social science problems. And he's going to go over the state of the art in this talk. He talks about how social structure is the aggregate of patterns, social arrangements in society that are both emergent from and determinate of the actions of individuals. So this is where social structure is both emergent from individuals and determine the actions of individuals. So there's this um, feedback that is where social agents both create their social arrangements and are constrained by those social arrangements. So this opens three important questions. The first is how social structure is implemented in human minds. Then the second is the relation between social structure and agency. And then the third is how does social structure change between contexts or over time? So this is, social structure is a sort of an old idea. It goes back to Levi-Strauss and the structuralists. And the idea is, you have these structures that exist sort of outside the individual, something like culture, where, you're embedded in culture, but you also create culture. And so the question is like, how does culture evolve or come to be? And then, how do you recognize culture as sort of a unit of measurement? How does culture change? How do individuals influence cultural change? Things like that. So that's very relevant to sort of this, and it's interesting, the structural view is French school of thinking, so he's also French, and so there's this continuity there. But it's just thinking about those kinds of questions and then bringing an active inference cast to them. So then, yeah, just talk about active inference and cultural evolution, and there's this paper um, that talks about this thinking through other minds, a variational approach to cognition and culture. This is applying active inference to culture. Um, and the tagline here is the transmission of culture is enabled by the integration of regimes of attention, is enabled by thinking through other minds. So this is thinking about cultural transmission, or how cultural structures are transmitted, say, to the next generation, or to other people, or to, just kind of reinforcing cultural norms and values. And so the transmission of culture is, I guess, involves regimes of attention and this sort of theory of mind. So this is kind of how they're putting this together. It's interesting that cultural transmission, of course, is also a long-standing research problem. Most notably was addressed by Dawkins with his idea of memes. And then there was a journal of memetics that was around in the 90s and 2000s, but it never really kind of persisted. And interestingly, after the journal of memetics went away, the actual idea of internet memes came to be. So, like, as that journal was failing, the actual internet meme industrial complex came, rose to prominence. So people don't necessarily use the idea of memes anymore for cultural units of cultural transmission, but it is a useful sort of, maybe less than useful because it has so much baggage, but it is a useful sort of construct for thinking about the transmission of culture. And so they offer their own definition here. Yeah, this is Finding Common Grounds in a Life-Inspired Multi-Agent Simulation Environment, a research program for AI alignment. So yeah, in this talk, Adam Safran is going to be talking about AI alignment, but from the standpoint of these artificial life simulations. So Adam Safran right now is at the Allen Center for Discovery, which is at Tufts, and of course that's working with Michael Levin. Michael Levin's in that institute, and a couple other people. So this is kind of his take on AI alignment, but it's heavily based on these A-life simulations we'll see. So it's like there was this main talk, and then there are some simulations that were done showing, I don't really understand fully how they did these simulations. It was a platform that they developed at the Allen Discovery Center, and I'm not sure if it's based on continuous linear or if it's something else, because it looks kind of like continuous linear, but we'll look at it in a minute. So this is, he talked about a number of things about AI alignment in the talk, but he brought up this idea of having a Bell Labs for AI alignment research, and then, thinking about this in terms of active inference. So there are a number of people here involved that are also in the active inference world, um, and so they're doing a number of different topics. Um, they have someone who's building the simulations, people looking at agency and value, people looking at bounded rationality and formal modeling, multi-agent alignment, people looking at path flexibility and resilience, the mathematical modeling of value canalization. Canalization is this thing in development where things are buffered into certain channels through a developmental space, hence canalization, which is channelization. Um, and looking at sort of that in terms of free energy landscapes. So taking it from the developmental, uh, from the epigenetic landscape or developmental landscape metaphor to a free energy landscape. Also looking at multi-agent alignment protocols and biologically inspired architectures, artificial consciousness, affective alignment and maturity, and then effective neuroscience, AGI, and biologically inspired approaches to alignment. So this is something I think where they're looking for collaborators. I don't know. We talked about Bell Labs a couple weeks ago in our meeting, and I don't know if he's getting at can we harness the sort of creativity and innovation of Bell Labs, but that's what they're trying. That's sort of the mental model they're using for this collaboration. So this is their platform Common Grounds. And so this is where they're building these A-life simulations. So they have these little agents and they're exploring the world and they're playing with these balls of different things. They have these different sensory radii as well. So they're sensing things in the environment. Like I said, I'm not really familiar exactly with how these work, but I thought they were interesting to sort of mention. So this is where you have the simulator. You can play with the simulators as video games, and then you have these benchmarks for performance. So we build an A-Life simulator simultaneously support virtual worlds or games which bridge humans and AI through play. So people are playing the video games. There's a simulator where it's generating this stuff. People play these games, and then there's a benchmark. The benchmarks themselves are the social and cultural effects of AI interaction. So they're looking at how people are interacting with AI agents. And then there's this research and nurturing of benevolent embodied AI. So this is where they're trying to develop more sort of humanist AI or benevolent sort of embodied AI. That's kind of what they're trying to do here. So that's very interesting. I think the simulator and benchmarks are open access. They're going to release the game demo on the web and Steam, and then iteratively improve simulator / game / benchmarks. So this is the environment. This is a screenshot of, this is, I think, concept art actually of the thing. So they're not quite done with it yet, but they're kind of showing how this works. You have interactors here interacting with different structures in the world. And then this is kind of where they have the sensory gradient here, and they're doing things in the world. I'm not really sure how this works, but they were just giving a short demo of this stuff at the symposium. This is the scaling of body and world. And so again, you have these, like I said, it could be continuous linear based on something like that. Continuous linear is a continuous cellular automata where you have locations in the world that are sort of centroids, and then you have, they behave kind of like cells in a cellular automata. So I'm not really sure what they're doing for this, but it does look interesting. And then this is just more scaling of the body and world. And then they're doing things like looking at interoception per body parts. You have this network within the agent. You have energy levels, nutrient levels, temperature, damage. There's some record of the organ state. And basically, the AI agents have this interoceptive system, which monitors their internal state, which monitors kind of how they behave. Interoceptive control provides analogs of hormones / visceral motor system. So if the agent is interacting with things in a good way, it's feeling good. If it's interacting in a bad way, it feels bad. And then there's this whole interoceptive control system, which is based, of course, on allostasis, which will regulate the behavior of the agent. It's quite I think, an ambitious kind of approach to AI safety and agent safety. Then there's vision. So this is their visual system where, they kind of model this agent visual system as a one-dimensional array of ray hits. So it's like the rays are coming out of the eyes, or rays are going into the eyes, where there's a connection between objects in the environment and the visual system. So it's capturing all of these images or all of these points, and there's this one-dimensional set of points, like a line that kind of connects all this and gives a map of the world like this. So this is the first-person view of these visual rays hitting these different objects. So you see these green objects, and then there are these other, the body here, which is this light tan object, and then this ball down here, which is the dark green or dark brown object, and then the dark green objects are these balls here. So you can see how it's kind of mapping the visual system from sort of a side view of the eye and the interactions with objects to this first-person view. And so there are these different viewpoints that one can take on the environment, and that affects the interoceptive regulation. And then this is more concept art. This is the visual, or this is the sort of the sensory radius here. There are these interaction points with objects. There's this interoceptive network. And so you can see examples of that here. And then they want to look at varieties of life. So they look at this as a model of development and evolution. You have reproduction, where new cells bud off of old cells. And then you have communications between cells to sense and act. So it's really this kind of A-life approach to agent development, and then that leading to AI safety, because agents kind of know their own bodies, they know their own context. Here are two cooperating individuals. This is synchronous joint activity, where they're vicariously enjoying a single object. They're sharing access to the object. And then this is potential future work, cooperating molecules, where they have molecular scale particle cell simulations, membranes as strings of particles, cells coupled by gap junctions. You can see them in red. Molecules of various types, information, metabolic, structural, and then this analogy of origin, modeling the origin of life in undersea vents. So you could model this sort of simulation environment isn't just good for AI safety and for agent design, but also for looking at different things having to do with cells, development of cells, evolution of cells, and the origin of life in these vesicles. And so then they talk about how all of these simulations are in 2D space, but and they don't do it in 3D space, but if you extend it out to 3D space, there are interesting properties that emerge. So rich embodiment possible in 2D continuous space. 2D is simpler, easier to visualize, computationally cheaper, but there are rich properties of 3D space that 2D space does not have. And so we may actually have good enough 2D approximations to do knotted strings and embeddings of arbitrary graphs. I guess that's the 3D space, but then the 2D space has crossover points to that. So you can capture some of that in 2D, but to capture it fully, you need three-dimensional representations. You also have these non-commutative rich rotation groups, where you can map the full range of real-world motor skills to these agents. You also have a rich range of motor skills available in 2D continuous space. And there's this hypothesis in cognitive science called the grounding hypothesis, or the grounding idea, that you need to ground conceptual metaphors So you need to have sort of a ground state for metaphors or for meaning, and they don't seem to find that in their simulations. So it's interesting that they're using embodiment sort of as a stand-in for that. So there are all sorts of things you can look at these different representations of space and how that contributes to these simulations as well. Okay, this is another kind of shot from one of the. So there were a bunch of talks after Adam's talk. It was like these 2-minute talks. They had 2-minute talks and they had the longer talks. So the 2-minute talks were kind of like on very focused topics. This is something called cross-scale agency and inner alignment. This is I just like this picture because it was like of an amphibian, kind of had this cartoon cross section. But this is talking about agent scale action via the collective effects of microagents and action as an extension of autopoiesis. So autopoiesis is related to action, or action rather being an extension of this autopoietic regulation. So, there were a lot, of course, everyone was talking about these topics: autopoiesis, homeostasis, allostasis, regulatory control, complexity, very much in the theme of the conference or the symposium. Now we get to Carl Friston's keynote, which was actually at the beginning of the symposium. This is his. So they always give the main keynote to Carl Friston, obviously, because he's sort of the person who developed active inference as a tool, or at least initially. His talk was Active Inference, Learning, and Selection. And this talk offers a formal account of insight and learning in terms of active Bayesian inference. So active inference is Bayesian in nature, at least according to Carl. It deals with the dual problem of inferring states of the world and learning its statistical structure. In contrast to current trends in machine learning, like deep learning, we focus on how agents learn from a small number of ambiguous outcomes to form insight. The presentation uses simulations of abstract rule learning and approximate Bayesian inference to show that minimized or expected free energy leads to active sampling of novel contingencies. This epistemic, curiosity-driven directed behavior closes explanatory gaps in knowledge and the causal structure of the world, thereby reducing ignorance, in addition to resolving uncertainty about states of the known world. We then move from inference to model selection, or structure learning, to show how abductive processes, so this is abduction in the logical sense, in the reasoning sense, and this is not like deduction or this is abduction, which is where you're kind of coming up with new solutions. Emerge when agents test plausible hypotheses about symmetries in their generative models of the world. The ensuing Bayesian model reduction evokes mechanisms associated with sleep and has all the hallmarks of so-called aha moments. We talked about this in past meetings, and we actually mentioned aha moments in our paper on world models and regulator theorem. I just wanted to revisit that because I thought it was interesting. We conclude with the generalization of active model selection to simulate artificial reasoning. So this talk was about looking at artificial intelligence, going back to sort of the statistical roots in physics of artificial intelligence, statistical physics, and then moving forward to modern models. So he introduces the 3 phases of what he calls AI physics, which was Hermann von Helmholtz, Richard Feynman, and Edwin James. So Richard Feynman, of course, everyone knows who he is. Von Helmholtz developed a lot of the early like things like Boltzmann machines and things like that, or what would become called Boltzmann machines. And then James had this interesting relationship with what they call surprisal, or what you might call entropy, or some people call it negentropy, which is looking at sort of entropy, informational entropy, and how that relates to thermodynamics. A very interesting bit of work. I actually did work through some of James's work in the talk that we had. It was like 2 years ago. It was on the stuff we did for thermodynamics um, and learning. And so I'll have to pull that back up next week. But for now, just remember that Jaynes is an important person, Feynman's an important person, and von Helmholtz is an important person. So von Helmholtz has this quote associated with him: objects are always imagined as being present in the field of vision, as would have to be there in order to produce the same impression on the nervous mechanism. So this is talking about sort of visual perception, and thinking about visual neuroscience and sort of the statistical, what would become sort of known as the psychophysics of visual neuroscience, but also then leading to this sort of statistical interpretation of visual perception. And this, of course, would contribute greatly to our current AI models. And so we have, in this figure, we have Richard Gregory, but at the bottom we have Thomas Bayes. So we have Bayes' theorem, we have the Helmholtz machine and the Bayesian brain. We have Jeff Hinton and Peter Dian, Jeff Hinton, of course, developed deep learning. Peter Dian is a computational neuroscientist, and then Richard Feynman over here, who developed some of the StatMech for this. So here's Richard Feynman, here's Judea Pearl. And so, Judea Pearl, of course, is a causality person. And so this is kind of thinking about the Bayesian brain. So this is a model of the Bayesian brain where you have sensory states encoded in S dot, the brain encoded in mu dot with internal states, and then active states with A dot, and then there's a feedback between active states and internal states, and then active states produce external states, or eta dot, and then external states contribute to sensory states, which then contribute to internal states. So you have these two feedback loops that culminate in internal states, producing active states, being influenced by sensory states, and then external states, or the action, is or the active state contributes to the external state, which is the action outcome, and then that sort of shapes the sensory state. So that's kind of the idea here. And there are a whole bunch of equations in there that sort of allow us to model that mathematically. Then there's the variational free energy, and that leads us to the paths of least action. So we have statements for action and perception. For action, we're trying to minimize action. For perception, we're trying to minimize the sensory states. For action, we're trying to minimize the active states. So that's how that works. And then we have the Markov blanket, which leads to the free energy principle, the path integral formulation, and that leads us to active predictive coding. And of course, we have to understand causality in that, because we have to understand what causes what. Okay, so this is just kind of like working through the math here. There's expected free energy, variational free energy, and then that's that model. Introduce that. Then the Helmholtz decomposition, which contribute to gradient flows and predictive coding. So this is just kind of thinking about some of the math that Helmholtz introduced that allow us to minimize prediction error and produce this percept of this howling wolf in this case, from an image that's sort of grainy and noisy. And so we can take that prediction error and minimize it and come up with a conscious percept, a very specific conscious percept. And sometimes we can do this improperly, which is sort of the minimization aspect of this. You minimize your error. Sometimes you converge upon something that's wrong. So we could say that the wolf is, this isn't a wolf, this is a dog, or this is a, it could be a rabbit, even if it's like ambiguous enough. And then this is Jaynes' work. So this is the free energy and maximum path entropy principle. So this is Jaynes' work on minimum entropy production, the minimum entropy production principle, which was published in the Annual Review of Physical Chemistry, where he talks about maximum path entropy being equivalent to minimum entropy production. So this is where you have this path entropy of the different paths taken through the world, and then that leads to minimum entropy production, which is this sort of maximization of sort of efficiency, the minimization of error. And so this is the equation that he states here. There's this constraint, there's path entropy, and then that's greater than the entropy of the system. So this is all to say that this is useful in looking at free energy minimization, and it also relates to optimizing deep learning networks, because remember, deep learning networks are about minimizing your error and doing this on a gradient. So we have the similar mathematics with a similar sort of statistical structure we're working with.